So, for my first ever Sunday story, I read a story by John Edgell, and I thought it might be nice for my first one of 2021 to go back to his very groovy book of ghosts. I like his kind of slightly sinister but also a little bit comfortable way of telling a ghost story. It's ideal for what I wanted, and what I always wanted for the Sunday story was for everybody, whatever age you are, to be able to sit down and listen to a spooky story. Having said that, I have started doing on my YouTube channel slightly more intense stories that aren't intended for the younger listener. The first one's up. It's called What Nature Abhors, and it's one of my all-time favourite horror stories. So they're a bit more adult orientated and a little bit longer. So tonight's story is called The Mahogany Wardrobe. Mr. Tippet kept himself to himself. He didn't owe the world anything, why should he? The world had given him nothing. He lived in a rundown house in a dirty terrace near the canal, and each day he walked to work along the canal to the office at the metalworks. Once he had a lodger in his house, but the lodger had made such a nuisance of himself. He came home late at night, singing and carousing and filled with whiskey. It was disgusting. People ought to conduct themselves properly. People like the lodger had no place in this world. Mr. Tippet liked to be alone. Now that the lodger was dead, he had the whole house to himself. Not that he needed it, really. He did very little entertaining. In fact, he almost did no entertaining at all. When the lodger had gone, Mr. Tippet went into his room at the top of the house and was almost sick at the stale smell of whiskey. He went to open the windows, but they were stuck. They'd got stuck last time they'd been painted, about 11 years ago, when the paint had solidified like putty in the window frame. Never mind, thought Mr. Tippet. He wasn't going to use the room anyway. He'd close it up, and he would never have another lodger. He was about to go downstairs when he suddenly saw the mahogany wardrobe. He'd forgotten it was there. It was a tall construction with high double doors and thick decorative carvings running all round the edges. The chairs and table had been knocked about a bit, no doubt when the lodger had crashed around the room in his drunken stupors. And the brown woolen curtains were not in good condition either. They were torn and greasy, and some of the hooks at the top were missing. I must have been mad to take a lodger, thought Mr. Tippet. They paid their rent, if you were lucky, but then they smashed up all your property. It was disgusting. Mr. Tippet would never have another lodger. Looking round the room, the wardrobe was the only piece of furniture still in good condition. The dark wood had a dim shine on it, and the ornate brass handles on the doors were polished and gleaming. Mr. Tippet peered at the wood closely. There was hardly a mark on it. Perhaps he could sell the wardrobe. A piece of furniture as smart as this might fetch a good price. It might fetch as much as £20. Mr. Tippet stepped back and studied it critically. Yeah, it might well fetch £20. First, he must make sure it contained nothing of value. He hunted about for the key. Where could it be? Night was beginning to darken the room, and he couldn't find it. Never mind. It'd keep till tomorrow. As usual, Mr. Tippet left the metalworks at 6 o'clock sharp and made his way home along the banks of the canal. The canal was a filthy blot on the landscape. No barges ever passed along it these days. The banks were overgrown, the concrete shearing was falling into disrepair. The thick, greasy water lay motionless, and dead fish lay on the surface. Mr. Tippet turned up his coat collar. He had good reason to dislike the canal. As soon as he reached home, Mr. Tippet went upstairs to the lodger's room to look for the key for the wardrobe. Mr. Tippet was certain he did not have a duplicate. The key must be here somewhere, if only he could find it. So much rubbish littered the room. Dirty bedsheets, old newspapers, bottles, broken chairs, that he decided to clear everything out piece by piece until he found the key. He took off his coat and set to work. He fixed a chair under the doorknob to hold it open and began to carry all the rubbish downstairs out to the small garden at the back. Tomorrow he would have a blazing bonfire and burn everything in the lodger's room. Well, everything, that is, except the wardrobe. Mr. Tippet was out of breath carrying all the things, and had time to pause when he climbed up the stairs the second time. He leaned against the door, recovering his strength. The room was almost bare. But still, he'd not found the key. Then he noticed something odd. The wardrobe seemed to have moved about 18 inches along the wall. Mr. Tippet considered this anxiously for a moment. He hadn't moved it. He hadn't even touched it. Could it be a trick of the light? Already night was beginning to fall, and very little light penetrated the murky window. No, the wardrobe hadn't moved. He just imagined it, now that most of the other furniture was gone. Rooms always look different when they're empty. Mr. Tippet wondered whether to put a shilling in the meter to put on the light, but he decided against it. He would sooner risk the darkness than waste a shilling. Anyway, he thought, feeling in his pockets, he didn't have a shilling. He moved the last item from the room, the threadbare carpet. He rolled it up in a long bundle and dragged it outside onto the landing. It was like dragging a dead body. Tomorrow he would burn it. Then, stepping back into the room, he saw the tiny brass key to the wardrobe lying on the bare floorboards. The lodger must have hidden it under the edge of the carpet. The room was now in total darkness. It looked quite different without the furniture. The floorboards groaned every time Mr. Tippet moved his feet, and the room itself suddenly seemed cramped. The ceiling had come lower and the walls were pressing inwards. The only things in the room were Mr. Tippet and the wardrobe. The wardrobe threw long, murky shadows in every corner. Mr. Tippet put the key in his pocket and decided not to open the wardrobe until tomorrow. Then he hurried downstairs. At 6 o'clock sharp, Mr. Tippet left the metalworks. He turned out of the factory gates and turned into a narrow alleyway that led down to the bridle path by the canal. It would soon be winter. Darkness fell more quickly than it had done all that week, and Mr. Tippet walked a little faster than usual. At the bottom of the alleyway, he saw a shadow. Was someone waiting for him? Was it the dead lodger? He clenched his fists in his overcoat pockets and kept close to the wall. He tried not to breathe, but this made his chest ache, so he breathed slowly and quietly, turning his face sideways at each breath. In a minute, he was at the bottom of the alleyway. He stopped. The shadow had gone. The only shadows were those cast by the wooden fence and by the old street lamp that no one had thought to switch on. He turned left along the bank of the canal and began to hurry himself, glancing quickly to the right and the left, and sometimes glancing over his shoulder. The canal looked even more horrible in the dark. It was like a giant serpent, lazily asleep between the rows of factories on either side. It was so dark that Mr. Tippet could hardly make out the surface of the black water. Then he heard a small splash, as if someone had thrown a pebble into the water. Since the splash came from somewhere behind him, he didn't bother to turn round, but hurried along the muddy path even faster than before, almost tripping over a cardboard box which had rolled in his path. Mr. Tippet thought of the dead lodger, lying at the bottom of the canal, drowned and quite dead where no one would find him. When he'd locked and bolted the front door behind him, Mr. Tippet went into his sitting room and flopped into the armchair. His heart was beating fast. Why should he feel so nervous? No one knew his secret. After a few minutes, he rose unsteadily and went to the windows to make sure they were properly fastened. Then he walked into the kitchen and locked the back door. He pulled all the curtains. He didn't go upstairs. The house felt very cold, even for November, and the draught seemed to blow from under every door and from every window. Mr. Tippet went to the glass jar on the mantelpiece. He emptied some shilling pieces into his hand. He crouched by the meters in the kitchen, the hall, and the sitting room, and put 3 or 4 coins in each. Then he turned up the electric fires as high as they would go, to bring some warmth into the cold air. But after half an hour, he still felt as cold as ever. He was still wearing his overcoat. Beating his arms against his sides, he walked rapidly up and down the room, trying to restore his circulation. He'd never known such cold, and yet all the electric fires seemed to be burning brightly. In the morning, he would call in the electrician to check that the appliances were all in working order. It was then that Mr. Tippet heard the lodger laugh. The shrill sound made the skin on his back crawl, as if picked by a million ants. The laugh seemed to have come from outside the sitting room, but faintly, as if the lodger were hiding somewhere at the top of the house. It was a dead laugh, a harsh echo of death, which made Mr. Tippet begin to shake in his overcoat. No, surely the lodger was in the canal. Then silence fell, and the loud echoes in Mr. Tippet's mind began to fade away. Mr. Tippet knew that he must climb the stairs. Unless he stamped out the fear from his mind, he knew he would never be able to return to his house. It would become a living morgue. He eased open his sitting room door and listened into the hall. He heard the steady ticking of the grandfather clock. There was nothing else. Nothing at all. After a few moments, he stepped cautiously into the hallway. The overhead light seemed to dim at his approach. Slowly, he began to mount the stairs. Since the house was old, the stairs began to groan. Mr. Tippet thought it was ridiculous to frighten himself in this way. He knew it was his own feet that caused the noise. But towards the top of the stairs he faltered. His legs felt weak, and his cold hands could hardly feel the smooth banisters. He began to sense that something was wrong. It was as if the very house was silently waiting. He forced himself to creep up the last few stairs and found himself on the landing outside the lodger's room. He listened with his ear to the door but could hear nothing. Then, just as he began to turn the door handle, he heard the unmistakable sound of a key being turned in a lock somewhere inside the room. Mr. Tippet waited, his heart in his mouth. Could someone be turning the key of the wardrobe? Why would they do that? And who could it be? Perhaps it was a burglar. Taking his courage in both hands, Mr. Tippet flung open the door. The room was empty. Nothing was to be seen but the tall wardrobe. A sentinel, bearing down in the shadows against the wall. Mr. Tippet began to wish he'd locked the front door. He crept across the room and turned the key in the wardrobe door and slowly pulled it open. Unloosing the inside catch of the second door, he drew the wardrobe open as far as he could. He saw a jumble of macintoshes and overcoats swinging from their wooden hangers. He reached in with both hands and felt about. He didn't know what he was looking for. He'd never imagined that a wardrobe could contain so many clothes. There must be dozens, scores of suits and coats crowded closely together. The further in he reached, the more rows of coats he found. And still, his fingers could not reach the back of the wardrobe. The wardrobe was like a small room. He put his left foot inside the chamber so that he could reach in still further, but even this didn't seem to help. There was only one thing to do. Grasping the lintels of the doors, he heaved himself up and climbed right inside the stifling blackness. Suddenly, the heavy mahogany doors closed behind him. Struggling among the heavy coats, he heard the sound of the key being turned in the lock and felt a wet hand reaching for his neck. The following week, a public health officer came to Mr. Tippet's house and found his corpse hanging from the neck inside a locked mahogany wardrobe. The corpse had been dead some days, and the public health officer had been admitted to hospital with acute shock. By chance, the police had, on the same day, recovered an unidentified body from the canal. There was nothing to link the two murders. Nothing, that is, except a small brass key found on the body in the canal. Oh, Mr. Tippet. So that's a morality story. The moral of the story is, don't murder people. Otherwise they'll get you. Well, thank you for joining me, guys. Don't forget, if you want something a bit meatier, then there's that other story on my channel. I'm going to be doing it. It's not going to be a weekly thing. I'm going to be doing one every 2 to 3 weeks because it takes a little bit longer than these two to put together. So, Happy New Year as we march proudly into 2021. And I will see you folks next week.